Thank you. Right. I think we can start. I will start recording. Now, before we do, could you hear everything fine, okay? All right. Now get stuck in, and this, just one little thing at the end to say. When we open the programme, you're all in shot, so even though you've been sitting here for an hour, the blazing lights, can you look as if you've just come in, fresh and just arrived, like the panel does?
You need the makeup lady, I think.
Yes. Okay, I'll do it my own time. Right. Okay, right, yes, let's go. All right. Okay. George Bush, Tony Blair, and those weapons of mass destruction are back in the headlines, but over 6 years since the Iraq War started. How does the public think about it now? Welcome to Question Time. And with me on the panel here in Edinburgh tonight, Lord Falconer, one of Tony Blair's closest political allies, both Justice Secretary and Lord Chancellor in his cabinet. The former Shadow Home Secretary David Davis, who lost out to David Cameron in the race for the Tory party leadership. The Deputy First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon of the Scottish National Party. The Daily Mail columnist Melanie Phillips. And the broadcaster and comedian Marcus Brigstocke. And just a reminder that the panel don't know the questions before they're put to them by our audience. The first one comes tonight from Mark Boyce, please. Mark Boyce.
Does the recent evidence to the Iraq War inquiry support allegations that Tony Blair misled the House of Commons?
And we've only had a couple of days of it. Nicola Sturgeon.
I think the evidence we've heard so far this week proves, in my view, that Tony Blair not only misled the House of Commons, Tony Blair misled the entire country in taking us into the Iraq War, not on the basis of one lie, but on the basis of a whole catalogue of lies. I think what we're going to get in this inquiry is not so much the truth, because I think most people know the truth already. What I hope we're going to get, and what on the evidence so far this week we are getting, is more evidence of the truth and more detail of the truth.
Well, what is it you draw attention to in particular?
Well, I think there's a number of things. You know, we've always suspected that Tony Blair promised George Bush that he would go to war while he was still telling the country that no decision had been made. I think we've heard more evidence of that this week. We've heard this week that the advice was that a war to effect regime change would have been illegal. And I think what we then saw was a whole process to try to manufacture a justification for going to war. So there were supposedly links between the Iraqi regime and Al-Qaeda. We've heard this week that the UK intelligence said that wasn't the case. And I think most dramatically and most damning this week, we have heard evidence to the effect that ministers were told some 10 days or so before the invasion of Iraq that Saddam Hussein did not have the biological and chemical weapons that Tony Blair stood up in the House of Commons and said that he did have. So I think we are seeing a picture emerge that proves beyond any doubt, if there was any doubt, that Tony Blair misled Parliament and misled the country. But let's also remember the role of Gordon Brown in all of this, because I think Gordon Brown, in setting up this inquiry, has been trying to distance himself from the Iraq War. Well, Gordon Brown went along with every decision, and he was the Chancellor whose fingerprints are all over the chequebook that paid for the illegal Iraq War.
Okay. Well, Lord Falconer, as a very close advisor on all this period to Tony Blair, you went along with all the decisions. Does the evidence that's coming out discomfort you?
No, it does not. And I completely accept my own responsibility in relation to it. I think it was the right decision. I think what Nicola is saying is complete rubbish. What Tony Blair said... Well, give me a chance to explain it, because your reaction is the reaction at the moment of most people who look at it. But Tony made a speech on the 18th of March in the House of Commons in 2003, before the House of Commons voted. And in that, he went through all of the evidence in support of the existence of weapons of mass destruction, and most of it came from the United Nations. And he ended with a report given by Hans Blix on the 7th of March, which said what they had found in the previous 3 months in looking for weapons of mass destruction. And there were signs that there were some, but you couldn't come on the basis of the Blix evidence to an answer. Don't say that the country was misled, because he laid before Parliament all of the evidence, and all of the evidence accurately, and it was for the House of Commons to decide. And what's more, the House of Commons had the contrary view expressed by Robin Cook, and the House of Commons, by a massive majority, including David Davis, decided that the right thing to do was to enforce the arms control regime, which the United Nations themselves were saying they'd failed to enforce. Now, you could disagree. You could disagree.
Seize the chairman in order to make your point.
You could disagree with the principle of going to war in Iraq, and very many people did before and after. But the one thing I think is clear is that the House of Commons knew perfectly well what the arguments were on both sides of the fence, and they decided to go for armed intervention.
Now, you've made several points. Can I just put to you one particular point? Did the House of Commons hear, as presumably you heard, the evidence of Sir William Ehrman, the Director of International Security at the Foreign Office, who this week said, April 2000, the picture was limited, the knowledge was patchy, March 2002, sporadic and patchy, the intelligence is poor, August 2002, little intelligence on these weapons, and the assessment by 9th September 2002, intelligence remains limited. In other words, endless attempts to tell you at the centre of things that you shouldn't trust what you're hearing.
David, all of the intelligence material was looked at by Lord Butler in the Butler inquiry, all of that's the Joint Intelligence Committee assessments of what the intelligence showed, because intelligence is a whole range of things being brought together, and since 1991, without break, the Joint Intelligence Committee had been advising the government, of which I was a part, that their view was that Saddam Hussein did have weapons of mass destruction. It turned out that there weren't any, but almost every intelligence service in the world was misled by Saddam trying to get weapons of mass destruction and saying to the world outside he probably had them. Now, again, I come back to the basic point. You may well disagree with going to war, but please don't accept the myth that Tony misled the country, because he didn't. The country was in full possession of the facts, and Butler said Tony gave a fair interpretation of what the intelligence was saying at the time. We can regret what happened in Ramadan, and I, as it happened, remained strongly supportive of the intervention. But it was on the basis that the Commons and the public knew what the position was.
Marcus Brigstocke.
I think what seems to be clear, not only from this inquiry, but from previous ones and from lots of discussion, is that the build-up to the Iraq war happened on a timetable. It was fixed. They knew when they wanted to go in. That was a decision that seems even to have been made possibly years before. And once Washington had decided when they wanted to go in, even if the very best intentions of the government were to look at the intelligence, they had to start finding and they had to start prioritising the things that pointed towards meeting a deadline for war. That is not, under any circumstances, if you must decide to go to war at all, the way that you go about doing it. You don't set a date and then build your case in order to coincide with that. It's a disgraceful way to behave. I think it's actually worse than misleading. I think it's altogether more sinister than that. And you know, Christopher Mayer today said that our government and Washington were, I think he said, grasping for a smoking gun. If it wasn't grasping, it was
scrabbling around.
Scrabbling around. I mean, what an undignified way to take two nations to war and to destroy the lives of hundreds of thousands of people, innocent people in Iraq. It's an absolute disgrace.
That's Marcus's gloss.
Well, it was Sir Christopher Mayer's words. We found ourselves scrabbling around for the smoking gun.
But Sir Christopher also said today...
And we've never really recovered from that because, of course, there was no smoking gun.
But what Sir Christopher also said... What Sir Christopher said today was that as a result of pressure from the British government, the Americans were persuaded to go down the UN route, which is a perfectly appropriate way to deal with the issues of war and peace. But and what's happening all the time, Marcus is doing it, David is doing it, you're selecting little bits of evidence and
like-
not
like
looking
the-
at
like
the
the
overall
government.
position.
Charles, you're
David Davis.
No, I'm relying on what Lord Butler has said, having looked at all of it.
Well, all right, let's
We're
take
beyond
Lord Butler.
Lord Butler now.
Well, let's take Lord
Well, I
Butler.
think only pick up the bits of evidence
David
given over
Davis.
2 days.
That's what
Lord Butler's
Lord
phrase, you know, a real establishment man for what happened was that the government took the outer edge of the envelope of interpretation of the intelligence. That was the phrase, the outer edge of the envelope. And of course, I was one of those who voted for this, one of the many people in the House, because we believed the Prime Minister. You know, the oldest democracy in the world, we do believe the Prime Minister when he stands up and says there is clear evidence of weapons of mass destruction, which is what he said. Not true. The question for me is not whether he misled the country and the House. He did do that. The question is whether he misled himself, which he used to do quite a lot, or alternatively, whether he constructed this case having already made up his mind. That's what we at the moment don't know. I mean, Marcus asserts we do. We don't know that yet, and I think that's what we're going to get out of the end of this exercise. But let's understand something else as well. The whole of the West dragged themselves through this. The evidence of relationships between Al-Qaeda and Iraq was arrived at by evidence obtained under torture. They tortured a man called Ad-Libi 48 times until he eventually said, yes, yes, there is a relationship. Al-Qaeda and Saddam Hussein are allies. And that's why that's one of the reasons they went to war. Now, was that because of a construction? Because we agreed, not we, but the Prime Minister and the President agreed in advance and then manufactured the evidence, or is it they just deluded themselves? That's what we'll find out, and I think actually that's the most important thing to come out of this inquiry.
The British government never at any time suggested there was a link between Al-Qaeda and Saddam Hussein.
There are many hands up in this audience. The man there in the blue shirt, you, sir. Yes.
It's quite staggering that Lord Falconer continually interrupting other people in this constant stream of sort of trying to defend what went on. There's that phrase about people who are guilty almost speak too much and try and talk their way out of trouble. It seems that that's what's happening here tonight. And to try and say that the gentlemen who were speaking today were deluded and we're just picking at various bits of evidence, it seems that's exactly what he's doing, just picking at the bits he likes.
Okay, and the man over there.
We all know that the weapons of mass destruction was just an excuse. I was in America 6 months beforehand, and the American public were being told by their news that they'll keep them up to date with the showdown with Iraq. So it was planned years and years in advance.
All right, and you.
What sanctions should there be to deter a future Prime Minister from misleading Parliament?
Okay, and the woman there over on the side there, yes, on the left, in red. In red here, on the left. You had your hand up, I can't see. All right, well, the man behind you then. I thought you had your hand up.
This is to Lord Falconer. I don't believe that it's right to blame the UN for something which you went to war based on very little evidence. And you may have said that Tony Blair stated the evidence that they had in his speech, but that's not what was broadcast to the public. Not everyone watches the House of Commons TV. They don't watch the whole speeches and things. If you're going to war, you cannot base it on the evidence that you had. There's
Melanie
no
Phillips.
reason for it at all.
I have to say, I think there's a really terrifying irrationality about this whole debate about the Iraq War, as exemplified by the behaviour of this audience this evening and several of these panellists. The fact is that the desire to get rid of Saddam, regime change, was adopted as a policy of the American administration in 1988 under Bill Clinton. That is because Saddam was understood to be an unconscionable threat to the free world. That threat was dealt with in a muted fashion until 9/11, when the calibration of the risk he posed changed, not because people thought he was behind 9/11, but because it was suddenly realized that there were people who were prepared to destroy America, and that Saddam was probably one of those people because of the combination of his regional ambitions, his godfather of terror, he was a godfather of terror, and his development of weapons of mass destruction programs. Now, this idea that there were no weapons of mass destruction programs is one of the evidences of irrationality. I fully appreciate that people had a different view to me. I supported the war in Iraq, although I didn't support how it then developed after Saddam fell. But I don't support the rewriting of history. And the fact is, you say that there were no weapons of mass destruction. The interim report by the Iraq Survey Group, headed by David Kay, reported in 2003 that he had found, quote, dozens of WMD-related program activities concealed from the UN inspectors, program activities involving biological weapons, biological material, clandestine networks of laboratories with equipment suitable for chemical and biological weapons research, research on biological weapons agents Brucella and Congo Crimean hemorrhagic fever, and that these programs existed until 2003. Until shortly before the war started in 2003. And he was amazed, said David Kay, that the press had not reported this. He said that Saddam was trying to produce ricin right up to the war, and if it hadn't been for the war, regardless of whether he had drums of chemicals, which we can all now see was a mistaken aspect of the intelligence, he was developing these programs. He was in breach of the UN resolution, which was a condition of the ceasefire of the 1991 war, that he proved to the world he had got rid of it. He refused to do so.
Very well. Nicola Sturgeon, do you want to answer those points?
Yeah, I do, because I don't think anybody on this panel, or I would imagine in the audience, is going to defend Saddam Hussein. But let's go back to what Tony Blair said. Tony Blair didn't say Saddam Hussein had the elements of weapons of mass destruction. Let's remember what the dodgy dossier repeated in the House of Commons actually said. It said, and Tony Blair said, that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction that were capable of being launched within 45 minutes. What we've heard this week from the inquiry is that some time before the invasion of Iraq, ministers were told, not just that UK intelligence services knew, but that ministers were told that the Iraqi regime did not have those weapons in assembled form. And that's what people find so objectionable, that the Prime Minister of the country can stand up in the House of Commons and say things that are blatantly untrue, and that I believe, although I take David Davis's point, I believe he knew at the time that he was saying something that was untrue. Now, somebody else asked about sanctions, and it's a very, very good question. My colleagues in the House of Commons, with others across parties, tried to impeach Tony Blair for this, and I regret the fact that that attempt didn't succeed. But the one thing I hope that comes out of this inquiry, because I think people know the truth, so it's not the truth necessarily that we're looking for, but I hope it points the finger where the finger deserves to be pointed, because it is a national scandal that Tony Blair has not been held to account for any aspect of what he did.
Right. Let's stick with one thing. Nicola Sturgeon said that just before the war, we heard this week that you got a report that the chemical weapons couldn't be assembled, and he hadn't yet ordered their assembly, and there was a suggestion that Iraq might lack the warheads. Did you get all that information in the way she described it?
I have no recollection of the particular report, but the evidence was given. No, the evidence was given a few days ago, but I think it was Sir William Erman said on the 10th of March, there was an intelligence report that said some chemical weapons had been disassembled and they might not have the warheads to deliver certain things. So William Erman then went, I think it was William Erman, went on to say, words to the effect, we didn't think that changed the position, because you're getting reports all the time, or the JI, the Joint Intelligence Committee is, and they've got to assess what the position is. So to say that that one piece of evidence, which the person who gave it himself said didn't change the position, it's very hard to hang on that piece of evidence the idea that that gives the lie to all that Tony said.
David Davies?
Well, I don't necessarily assume that Charles saw that evidence. I think William Erman said it went to the JIC, not necessarily to the Cabinet. So let's be clear about that. And it was way after the point at which Blair briefed the House of Commons, so we can't.
Sure, but he could have corrected what he previously said.
Well, I think that's letting the best be the enemy of the good. But I think there is a real issue here about whether I come back to this point about how deliberate it was, whether this was a self-delusion, and it's still possible in my mind this was a self-delusion. The dodgy dossier was all evidence which was selectively picked up, and in which the Prime Minister's press secretary, Alistair Campbell, helped construct. Now, when in our history does a press secretary help construct an intelligence brief? unless what they're intending to do is to create a case which suits something went before. So that's what worries me, that the fact is they may have deliberately set out to deceive the public, but they certainly deceived themselves.
Well, we've got weeks and weeks more of this evidence to come, so let's just have a couple more points from our audience before we move on. The man in spectacles there, and then I come to you. Yes.
Yeah, I don't see really why we're doing the inquiry, because it's not going to get us anywhere. It's just a waste of money. Remember the cash for peerages scandal? It's not like anyone got held accountable for that. And evidence has already been withheld, so what's the point?
Okay, and you, sir?
Would it not be better, perhaps, if any of the old cabinet members from the Blair days had any integrity, for them to apologise for the obvious mistakes they made, rather than trying to defend the indefensible?
Well, as one of those people, I feel strongly that the right decision was made. I equally feel strongly that the country was not misled. The gentleman behind you said, well, what's the point of the inquiry? Well, I hope that the inquiry will throw as much light as it is possible to do on the whole thing.
With the inquiry, some people feel so strongly about this issue, that and are so dogmatic about it, that the inquiry won't appease certain people.
Well, what do you think? We should have no inquiry? Or we should have as much material as possible? I think as much material as possible.
Your position, just to summarise, is no apology for anything that happened that you were directly involved in.
I see us having made a considerable number of mistakes, but the two issues that we've been debating now seem to me to be, was the public misled? In my view, no. Secondly, was the decision to use force in Iraq the right one or the wrong one? In my view, it was the right one.
Okay. The woman in red, the last point, please, then we'll go on.
Plenty of countries have weapons of mass destruction and we don't go to war with them. We have weapons of mass destruction. When will the government admit that we went to war over oil? And when will Tony Blair be tried as a war criminal?
We didn't go to.
Let's move on. Sorry, but we'll be off on a whole new track there. I think we should go on to another question. Patrick Hardman has one for us. Patrick Hardman.
Is global warming a scam perpetuated by a vocal minority, which has been seized on by government as an excuse to raise taxes and promote false green credentials?
Well, this on the day that it's been announced the President is going to Copenhagen and the Chinese have announced plans to cut greenhouse gas emission. Melanie Phillips, is it a scam perpetuated by a vocal minority, all this?
Yes. I've always thought it was a scam, even before the rather sensational revelations of the recent days about the email traffic involving a small group of scientists who appeared to be basically conspiring to deny the evidence that the climate was getting colder rather than hotter. The fact that there was this email traffic between this small group of scientists doesn't itself prove there was a scam and a conspiracy and all the rest of it, because this was only, 4 or 5 scientists, although they were very prominent on the global warming agenda. But what's most interesting about this email traffic was that the reason for their concern was that they didn't know how to deal with the evidence, the scientific evidence, which was casting such terrible doubt on their whole theory. One of them said, for example, I have my own article on where the heck is global warming. The high in Boulder, Colorado, for the last 2 days was below 30 degrees Fahrenheit. We've broken records the past few days for the coldest days on record. The fact is that we can't account for the lack of warming at the moment, and it is a travesty that we can't. And what this email traffic said to me was that here you have a group of people, and this is the global warming agenda generally, for whom they know it's an unchallengeable fact that global warming is happening. And so when they see the evidence that it's not happening, the facts, the scientific facts, had to be made to fit the theory. Now, that is zealotry, it is ideological zealotry, it is totalitarian in its attitude. The fact is, I'm afraid to say, and you may find this a little hard to understand and to take, because certainly the BBC isn't telling you this, but there is no evidence for global warming. That is to say, there is no evidence. Wait, please. I know that you are an audience of open minds. You've already showed it so this evening.
Phillips, come to the point and get on with it, would you please? Because then we can have other people involved in the discussion.
Let me tell you that the seas are not rising any more than is in any way out of the ordinary. The ice is not decreasing, it is increasing. The polar bears are increasing in number, and the temperature is going down, not up.
All right.
There is no evidence for this whatsoever.
Except in this studio. Marcus Brigstocke.
Please, yeah. 2009 was amongst the top 5 hottest years on record. 2010 is predicted to be the hottest year on record. The last 10 years have all been amongst the 15 hottest years on record. I've visited the Arctic twice, and the ice is disappearing. I can tell you that the Inuit people that I met in Greenland, who are not part of some grand conspiracy, as Melanie might have it, will tell you year on year they are seeing dramatic changes. The ice is reducing very, very significantly. I helped a team of scientists from the National Oceanography Centre to carry out their experiments. Not only is the sea warming up, it is also much less saline than is expected, which means that the ice on the ice cap is pouring into the sea. That affects not only the climate, but it also affects the way that the ocean currents work. Now, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is the largest scientific experiment of its time. Their work is meticulously peer-reviewed. And as Melanie quite rightly pointed out, this thing from East Anglia is, relatively speaking, insignificant. It's a few people. It doesn't, a few dodgy emails, point to a massive conspiracy. But to say that there is not evidence that the planet is warming and that we are major drivers in that and have a responsibility to deal with it is grossly irresponsible. It's already affecting millions and millions of people and costing lives.
Yes?
Hi, Melanie. If there's no global warming, what's Cockermouth and the flooding about in Britain just now? It's terrible, the weather, and you're saying that there's no global warming. It's disgusting.
All right. Let me leave Melanie just to ponder that and go around the rest of the panel. David Davis.
Well,
what about Cockermouth? Is that
No.
part of that?
I'll pick that up along the way. I mean, I'm an agnostic on this. I'm a scientist by training. I was a science minister when much of this early research was done. And it's an incredibly complex subject. I think there is global warming going on, but I'm not entirely persuaded. I think it's about 80% probable that it's caused by man, but I'm not certain of it. I resent acutely listening to people say the debate is over. In science, the debate is never over. The debate on quantum mechanics is not over, let alone the debate on climate change. And we've got to get this right. And we've got to get it right for 2 reasons. One, if we get it wrong and Marcus is correct, then we've got real problems in short order down the road. But if he's not right, a lot of the policies we're talking about are going to actually slow down growth quite dramatically, and that has big consequences for the poorest people in the world. And in much of the world, poverty is a life-threatening condition. So I think the probability is that is correct, but it's by no means certain yet. The second issue is people who say, well, if you buy the general argument, you've got to buy all our ways of dealing with it. And I think we have to think rather more broadly about how we deal with it. I think we have to talk about accommodation. We've got Copenhagen and problems in Copenhagen in terms of negotiation. But Buenos Aires in '92 promised to cut carbon output by 2000, didn't happen. Kyoto promised even bigger cuts by 2010, didn't happen. And the real problem you're going to face from Copenhagen is you're going to get lots of promises, and that won't happen either. So we've got to be serious about this. We've got to have the argument on a sensible, not a virulent basis, not call people deniers if you disagree with them, whatever, and actually get a responsible outcome which will actually both help save the planet and also look after the poor people on Earth.
How, if you were in government, how would you then pursue the policies that are being discussed at Copenhagen, for instance? Where do the Tories stand on this?
Tories are very pro. I mean, Tories take virtually Marxist point of view. The Tory party takes Marxist point of view. It is very pro getting a strong agreement at Copenhagen. I think the problem with some of this is that making these big promises. We've got more targets than a Ukrainian tractor factory. and about as much chance as meeting them, frankly. I mean, the problem with making these big targets is that's all very well, it's great propaganda, great headlines. The issue is how you're going to resolve the issue. And much of the things we're not thinking about is how do we accommodate for it. I mean, in this country, for example, we believe there's going to be rising sea levels, and yet we're not actually rebuilding our sea defences. Now, that's very low technology, very easy to do, and we're not doing it. Why aren't we doing things in a similar low-tech way for much of the parts of the world that are going to be threatened by this? We're not doing any of those things.
The woman in the third row, fourth row there.
I do agree that we do have an issue with this. However, I think the government, you love to use it as a scapegoat a lot of the time. At the moment, the airline industry is on its knees. We're hemorrhaging job losses left, right and centre, and yet the government has just introduced a tax on aviation